the Southeastern RR Museum, where he was everything from a docent to helping with engines. He has been a volunteer firefighter in New Mexico, the Sheriff's Department volunteer, and Red Cross disaster team. But more importantly, he's teaching me archives. So I give you John Pezzano.
Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is the railroad agent, and I'm going to talk only about the progression of the railroad agent in the 19th century. I'm not going to get into the 20th century at all. Okay, I'm going to give you miscellaneous information about the railroad agents, who and what was a railroad agent, okay, the duties, what was like, and then I'm going to talk about the three different periods. The early part of railroading during the Civil War, and then post-Civil War to the end of the century, how things changed. Okay, so the first section again is going to be what was the railroad agent, what were the duties, and what was it like. Okay, the meaning of a railroad agent varied a lot among railroads. Some of them considered the primary person that ran the station as being the railroad agent. So Saluda would have one railroad agent, even if there were they had people on the weekend or on off hours selling tickets or whatever. But other railroads considered anybody that was running the station at the time of day that they were there was the agent. So it varied, and of course the duties varied, but eventually in time they became standardized. And so sometimes it was the person in charge of the depot. Oh, by the way, is this a depot or is this a station? It's a depot. What's a depot? A depot is the building, okay? Saluda is the station. So when you would go to, Saluda, that would be listed as a station, but this building would be called the depot. In time, that kind of got intermixed, and people call them stations, okay? But in fact, the building that it's in, whether it be, for those of you that have taken Amtrak, whether it be, Pennsylvania Station in New York, or what are called, to be nice, are called M shacks, which are basically just, this temporary building set up in one of these small towns, or in some cases just a platform with no building, no protection for people waiting for the train to come in. All those are considered to be the station, and the building would be the depot. Okay, sometimes the one that was on duty was considered to be the agent, as I mentioned, and but they were really the face of the railroad in every town. So in Saluda, this person represented the railroad. So, if you had any complaints about anything to do with the railroad, you complained it to the agent, okay? And the agent was the one that had to pass it on, So if you didn't like the fact that the train made a lot of noise and a lot of smoke, and their smoke caused fires and burned your crops, you would go complain to the agent. So it was the total face of the railroad. Okay, so they were the representatives. They planned itineraries, so a person that was going from Saluda to Asheville, for example, would just buy a ticket. But if a person was going from Saluda to New York City, they would need to figure out what itinerary they had to go. Would they be going down to Spartanburg or Charleston and then changing the train to New York, or they would be going up to Asheville and catching a train to the East Coast and then a train up to New York. So the railroad agent would be the one sitting there trying to figure out an itinerary that would be best for them, depending upon whether the type of travel that they wanted to do, whether they were going to take a sleeper, whether they were going to go coach, etc. So they did all the planning for the people. They sold the tickets, okay? They sent and received carload and less than carload freight. So if you were a farmer and could fill a car, you would go to the agent and you would arrange to have them take the carload of freight, or 10 carloads of freight, of your products to wherever you want them to go. If, on the other hand, you needed to move the furniture of your house, which didn't take a full car, they would arrange for what they called less than carload load, and they would load it on board the train in a box car, and then send it to wherever you wanted to go. And then calculated the price, and you paid the price to do that. So they actually did all that handling. Okay, they maintained the depot. That means that they had to take care of sweeping it out, fixing it up, any changes that had to be made. They had to pay for the lighting, of course. In the most of the 18th century, that meant the gas lights or the candles or whatever that they used. But it was their job to maintain it. Now, they may hire somebody to maintain it, but that was usually only on bigger stations. Otherwise, there would be only one person that worked there. So, and they would normally work, on the hours that the trains came through. And in the early days, very rarely did the trains come through at night. So basically, it was a daytime job. But there might be 7 days a week type of job. They did the dispatching before the telegraph. Once telegraph came out, then the telegraph was used to dispatch the trains. Otherwise, it was the station agent that would have to know that there was another train coming from Hendersonville this way, and since it was only a single track, any train coming from Spartanburg to Saluda would have to wait here until that Hendersonville train arrived. And there was no way to tell when it was going to arrive, or if it was going to arrive. Okay, so it took a lot of work at dispatching trains. They also did handle the telegraph railroad business, so they had to know how to use the telegraph. And that business meant not only the messages about the trains, but anything to do with the railroad. Later on, they had to do the telegraph for commercial businesses. Once the telegraph was used initially was used by the railroads, but once that got started, other people said, hey, I want to get a message to my friend, or I want to get a message to, this company that's in Asheville. And rather than taking my horse up there to go talk to them. And so they would be the one responsible for getting that message from the station to the business. In some cases, they would send a runner, over with the message. Other times, people knew to come to the station and to say, "Are there any messages for me?" And they also took care of mail transfer. So when the mail came in on the train, they needed to get that out to the people. Most times, people would come to the station and get their mail. In some cases, there was no station. They would basically be a postal agent, but they may have been in a lot of places there was a postal agent, so he would have to get it over, arrange with the postal agent to either come and pick it up or get it to the postal agent who sold the stamps. But a lot of times, the towns were so small, they didn't have a post office. And so basically the railroad agent sold stamps. Okay? Sometimes there was no station, and so the actual station was just in one of the local hotels. Okay. And so, he worked out of the hotel, the agent. And so maybe he sold the stamps, or the hotel sold the stamps. Well, what was it like being a railroad agent? There are pros and there are cons, and among the cons is you had to master Morse code. If you couldn't master Morse code, out you went. So that meant that you had to learn how to do it. Initially, you learned it from somebody else, but later on there were places that started teaching the Morse code. So you could take, just like now, you could go take computer classes, place and become qualified to become a computer person. Okay, well, back in those days, you would go to somebody that would teach classes on Morse code, and then you would go to the railroad and say, I know Morse code. They would test you, and they would say, okay, we'll give you a job or not give you a job. They had very long hours, okay, because again, if a train was 2 hours late, they had to meet the train. They had passengers that were departing, they had passengers that were arriving, they had freight coming in, freight leaving. They had cars that might have to be switched onto the train. Okay, so they had to be there, and if it was at 3 o'clock in the morning, they better come back at 3 o'clock in the morning when that train came in. So, they also have responsibility for any other employees. So in bigger stations, when they had multiple employees, it was the agent in charge that had to discipline them when they showed up drunk. They had to make sure that they knew what they were doing, that the work got done, that was supposed to be getting done. There were a lot of disputes over unionization hours and workplace issues, obviously, and until they finally unionized the employees, it was rough going for them because they were at the mercy of the railroad.
Were they unionized here?
I'm sorry?
Were they unionized here in the South?
I believe they were. They all were, yeah, because all the railroad employees eventually were unionized because the unions was with the whole railroad. So, even though Southern Railroad, which covered this area, was Southern, it went up to New York. Okay, so they actually got to Washington. I think it was as far as they got. The Crescent was train. Southern went from Washington on down. So yeah, eventually they all got reunionized. And they also had to manage unruly individuals. So, people would hang out at the station or at the depot because it was, the place in town because that's where all the news came into. And so, if you wanted to be the first to learn what was going on in the country, the place to be was at the depot. And then you go run and tell your friends over at the bar, that you knew that what was happening, who was just elected president, or, who was your congressman. And remember, before that, before the railroad, it was the Pony Express. 2 weeks, then the telegraph came along, and it was a matter of hours.
I've forgotten. When did the telegraph?
1847. So it was pretty early. But it took a while before it got established, and everywhere. But the first people that picked up were the railroads because they're the ones that needed it. Because the problem was most tracks were single tracked, most areas. And the only way that you knew whether there was a train coming the other way, well, there were two ways you found out. One is you ran into them, which was not ideal. The other way was that they telegraphed to you that they had left the next station and were on their way to you. So the Hendersonville one, actually there was Hendersonville, and then there was Zirconia, Flat Rock, and I think there was one more.
No, Saluda. What's it?
Tuxedo.
Tuxedo, yeah. That's what I'm thinking of. So one of those stations would be notifying you that the train had left. Okay. You also never knew, except that when you got notified, was if there was a special coming through. A special meant that, this is a high priority train. And so all the trains have to wait till this train gets through. So, and that became a problem, with the single tracking until they have some way to communicate. Okay, what were the pros? Well, steady employment and advancement was a big thing. So in many places where you didn't have good employment and, if you were unskilled or you had just basic skills, you could easily lose your job. With the railroads, but quite often they stayed their whole careers with the railroads because they had a skill, and that was, managing people, knowing the telegraph, and being able to run an operation, basically an independent operation for the railroad. They got decent wages, so compared to what, especially when you talk about small towns where wages weren't very good, the railroad paid you much better wages, so you were one of the highest paid people in the town. You got to have a safe working environment. It it beat being the guy in the hotel that always gets killed, you know, in the bar. You know, if you watch the old Western movies, you know, where they always shoot up the bars, you know. You wonder how they managed to shoot every bar in town and break every chair, you know, miss cuts an arm and a leg. You have varying work days, and so you could arrange to have someone fill in for you and take a trip somewhere if you had to go somewhere, had to go visit your sick sister or brother in Montana. You were a very respected representative of the community. A, because you made more money than most other people, and B, because you had a very important job. The railroad was the thing in every community. It was the most important thing in nearly all communities. And you were working on, you know, the state-of-the-art company. This was the TikTok and Facebook and streaming sites of the 19th century was the railroad. Okay, and you know, remember this was new, and so you know, the fastest thing by far on wheels, and nothing was flying in those days. It's just like now, nothing's flying. They're all grounded, you know, or at least the airplanes get grounded. And people can wave their arms. Okay, so let's talk about now the different periods between pre-Civil War, Civil War, and after the Civil War. Okay, pre-Civil War, the people who were hired were generally, quite often, they picked people that were used to be hotel workers because they were used to working with customers. Okay, so you had to be a customer type of person. You know, you couldn't be the type of person that would say, you know, no, I don't want to sell you a ticket. The railroad wouldn't want you around very long. Or no, you know, don't bother me about the freight because, you know, it's too small. Railroads wanted all the freight business they could take. And the railroads tended to underprice things because they wanted people to move out west. They wanted to build the towns. The railroads were given land to build their railroads. The government gave them so much free land, like about half the property around the route of the train, that were either given to or given that as a grant, or given sold them as a payoff for work they did for the government. So they owned a lot of land, and there was nothing in this land. And so when a town was built, they owned the property and they could sell it. So they may not have owned the property of Saluda, but they might have owned the section next to Saluda. And so they could sell that to farmers moving in, because now there was a station where the farmers could sell their things everywhere. So the type of person they wanted was you know, somebody that knew telegraph, somebody that knew how to do that kind of business, somebody that knew finances. You know, you had to be able to price tickets, you had to be able to price the costs, you had to be able to look up schedules and figure out how much to charge people. You had to know how to handle moving the stuff from the depot to where it was supposed to be delivered, or arranging to have it picked up or delivered and brought to the station. So there was quite a bit of work to it, and so they needed it. So the type of person that they needed was a person that was really good at those kinds of things. The depots, by the way, they only hired men in those days. Very rarely was a woman hired in the early days. There were a few in a couple of cases, and it was only a little later that women started moving into doing things.
You learned that the women were big in the telegraph industry. There was more
Yeah,
women doing
that became a little later, yes.
Oh, later.
Oh, yes, I've got, there's a video from 1920s of a company in New York City took the videos of how the telegraph system worked and how they repaired their lines and everything else. 1,000 people working in that building, one building, doing sending of telegrams and receiving telegrams. And most of them were women. So, but in the early days, you know, it was only men. And there weren't a lot of women out especially in the West. Sometimes, again, the depots sometimes were hotels. They might have been nice buildings like this, but a lot of times these nice buildings didn't come along until there was enough business to justify the railroad building it. And these buildings would be owned by the railroad, the property would be owned by the railroad. And like in Hendersonville, the railroad donated the building to the city, but they didn't donate the property. Okay, City of Hendersonville pays $11,000 or so a year to what used to pay it to Norfolk Southern, now to Blue Ridge Southern Railroad, for lease of the property that building sits on. And if they ever want to get out of that, they have to move the building off of that property. And that would be kind of expensive. But you know, so like you've here in Saluda, moved it off of the original location, so it's not on railroad property. It was a new occupation, okay? So everything was new and untried. So no matter what they did, it was never done before. There was nothing like what was done with railroads. The only experience of moving large amounts of traffic of freight would be by water. And that was mostly on the coasts, the main riverways like the Mississippi and the Ohio and those rivers, and on the canals, like the Erie Canal and the B&O Canal. Other than that, you didn't really have a big amount of movement. Most people sold things locally. With the railroads now, you got to order products from Chicago and get them delivered into Saluda, North Carolina, or Alamogordo, New Mexico, and you know, in the middle of nowhere, and have these products there. So this made a big change. Also, farmers now, instead of going around selling to everybody in town, and if they produced too much milk, they had couldn't do anything with it, or they'd have to drive it by car over the hill to Hendersonville. Now they could put it on a train, on a refrigerated car, which in those days had ice in it to keep it cold, and they could have it sent to all the way to Asheville. You know, wow, long ways. Okay, so all this was new, and so the ability to do things like shipping refrigerated things, special trains to deliver certain products that were needed right away, all had to be invented. And railroad agents were at the front end of that because they were facing the customer on what was actually needed by the customers. And so they could tell the railroad, hey, you know, this is what the people are asking for, and the railroad would try to figure out how that could be done. You know, and so they were responsible for when to say, hey, we need more track out here to park trains because we have too many trains coming in. You know, we've got too many cars parked waiting to be unloaded and reloaded. And so we need sidings built and things. It was the railroad agent that was involved in helping to decide those things and where they would go because they knew the town, they knew the area. During the Civil War, big change came during the Civil War. Okay? The biggest thing, of course, is now you already had the telegraph, started in 1847, and I don't know if you remember, if you saw the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg. In it, you'll see Lincoln goes into a war room, and there are all these military people in the war room with telegraphs, and they were sending messages and receiving messages. And by the way, all those the actors that played those things were not actors. They actually were members of the Morse Telegraph Club, and they were actually sending real messages. Okay, so they weren't just clicking randomly, making believe they were sending a message. They'd actually send a realistic message. And so all of a sudden now you were sending not just maybe a few messages a day. You're now maybe sending hundreds of messages a day. okay? Because the generals were sending messages to their different divisions. Grant and Lee had to send messages to their division commanders, and the Lincoln and Johnson.
The telegraph is only one wire, right?
Yes.
So how did you determine who got the message?
Okay. Every station had, usually, if there was one track through, there were only two places you could go, one this way and one that way, okay? Your telegraph only went to the next station, okay? So if you wanted to send from here to Asheville, you sent it from here to Zaconia, or Tuxedo, and then Zaconia, and then East Flat Rock, and then Hendersonville, and then Asheville, okay? So each place received the message and retransmitted it, okay, in the earlier days. Later on, they had ways to, what they did was, the telegraphs have, if you look at the telegraph keys, like the one that's in that other room, there's a little slide switch on that key. And when you push the slide switch to the side, it says just pass the signal on through to the outgoing one. And so when you weren't there, you passed it through to the outgoing one so that a message from Saluda might, if there was nobody at the intervening stations, would then go to Hendersonville, where there would be one, or to Asheville, to the next station that had somebody sitting there that could pick up the message. So, but it was stop to stop. There was no, they didn't send it cross country in one big swoop, you know. And so that's why it didn't take, it only took, a minute or less for you to transmit the message, but you had a lot of minutes because there were a lot of places in between. And in fact, what the biggest advance that in telegraphy that Samuel Morse made, which made telegraphy worthwhile, was to go to between Washington and Baltimore, which is, he demonstrated you could do that. Before that, people had demonstrated they could go across the street or within a building, but that was as far as they could get, is that he had relay stations, that had basically a battery and retransmitted automatically the signal, okay? So there were unmanned places, and that's what you would put in between, would be unmanned places if there was no station in between, if it was too far for that signal to reach. But as time went on, they could use bigger and stronger batteries until they could get further distance. But initially, it was basically the furthest you would go would be the next station. So military, the number of military messages and the requirement of military messages to be encoded, because you didn't want the other side to know, to just attach a sounder right onto the wire, okay, and just listen into all the messages. You had to encode them. Then the guy at the other end would get an encoded one. He couldn't decode it. He'd have to turn it over to the military office there, and to the Army camp nearby, and get it to them. And they would probably have people in his station all the time, because this way they could. When a message came in, the dispatch rider would take it over to the camp, and then they would decode the message. Military transportation, okay? All of a sudden, you went from one train a day maybe to dozens of trains a day. You had trains bringing in ammunition. You had trains bringing in food. You had trains bringing in troops. You had trains bringing in equipment. Civil War was the first war that was fought with trains being a significant amount of the need of moving people and moving equipment and moving supplies. And that's how you evacuated the troops. Both sides did it. It was easier for the North to do it. They had far more tracks than the South did, but most of the time the war was being fought in the South. Okay, the only time it was fought in the North was when in Gettysburg and battles in Pennsylvania. But virtually all the war was fought in the South. that meant that the union was using and rebuilding the tracks that they had destroyed when the Southerners had it, and the Southerners were trying to destroy it when the Northerners had it. So now you're having a lot of equipment moving by train. That meant that you also had to have people monitoring the tracks. So if you had troops in Hendersonville and you had troops in Saluda, you didn't dare send a train if the enemy might have some troops wandering around, some cavalry wandering around that could attack that train. So you'd have to patrol that area. So the military had to work with the local dispatcher. And then the dispatcher would be sending messages up to the other end, telling them, yeah, it's safe to go, send a train down. Again, I mentioned that, the Union versus the Confederacy, okay, the difference in the amount of tracks that they had, but the fact that the Union was doing most of their work, their transportation, once they moved it to the border, they were doing it on southern tracks. Civilian transportation, they still had to maintain civilian transportation. People still had to get places. Farmers still had to get their food to the big cities of the East Coast and to places where the military could they would be buying it in the big cities and transporting it from big cities. So that stuff still had to go on in spite of the fact that there was military traffic. But military traffic was the vast amount of the traffic. So suddenly you had this giant increase in traffic that the railroads and the railroad agents had now to take care of. And that was a big job for the agents. Okay, the secrecy involved, as I mentioned, about not telling anybody about the trains and secret messages, etc. And they also had the problem of, the enemy destroying the tracks. So, trains had to make sure that when they went, that, there wasn't all of a sudden the other side had torn up the tracks or put some explosives on the track and trying to blow up a train or trying to attack a train. Okay, lastly, it was the post-Civil War area. That's where most of the changes started really occurring because things became more modern. The engines became more modern. The cars were modernized. There started to be sleeper cars, different types of travel. Travel became much more extensive once the country was back together again. People started big time moving out west. The government started offering free land grants. Well, you had to get out there. You had to get your farm equipment out there. You had to get food out there for people to live on. You had to get stores to have inventory out there. Okay, so there was a huge expansion of passengers and goods to the western states, the territories, the towns, and the cities out west. And so that meant they were going through the east because maybe you remember your manufacturing in those days was the big eastern cities. So New York was a huge manufacturing place. Boston was in New Hampshire and all. It was up in the Northeast where all the guns were made. You had all these cities offering things. The cotton was still coming from the south, okay, and it had to go where the industry was making the clothing, and then it had to be shipped out to west, where the people were. Okay, hiring became centralized, but at that time, so the railroad started, instead of having a local guy going out and hiring somebody to be the agent in Saluda, okay, it would be railroad the headquarters of Southern Railroad that would be hiring the people to go work in Saluda, and so they would be paying it directly for the salaries of those people. They would be deciding how many people would be in each station. And then the rest, they still had a lot of temporary agents, and so because the stations were mostly smaller, the cities were smaller, a lot of small towns. There were towns of, 100, 200 people, that all of a sudden there would be a silver strike or a gold strike or copper mine, copper was discovered, and the town would go from 200 people to 2,000 people in 6 months, okay? So that means thousands of people are going out there, and tons of equipment have to go out there, and all of a sudden now you have these products, these raw goods, copper ore and gold ore and silver ore being shipped back east. Morse code became mandatory. Okay, that meant everybody that worked in that as a whether they were doing dispatching in the station or whether they were doing the Morse code, or whether they were doing the selling tickets, they all had to know Morse code. So that became a mandatory thing for everybody. Now, it didn't count if you were the janitor, okay? But, if you were anything above basically janitor, you had to know Morse code, okay? And you had to be good at it. So that was enforced. There was no thing as not knowing it because by that time now, the Morse code had become very common to use for everybody. People were doing it, not just companies in the railroad, but a lot of individuals were sending messages, congratulating their cousin or saying, telling people that somebody in the family had died or whatever, any kind of news. Okay, and the hiring of non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, okay, to immigrants, to women. And the women always made a lower pay. That was one issue that they always had. Became quite more common. So, they needed to hire immigrants because there was nobody else. And they needed a lot more people. So in the 1850s, when the Irish people came over, and if they learned Morse code, they could be. They were the immigrants of those days, and they could become agents. And then a lot of women became agents, especially women out west, where if their husbands were killed, they couldn't take care of the farm. They would maybe move into the town and learn Morse code, and they could become an agent and get a decent salary. And so that became a lot more common, and a lot of women turned out to be outstanding agents and experts in Morse code and beating the men in speed of Morse code.
Was there any competition with Morse code, or was that, in other words, we only hear about it? In other words, were there some other codes?
No, there were no. Morse code is not Morse code. Okay, the code that Samuel Morse started, he worked with. I can't remember the other guy's name. He came up with his own Morse code, and this other guy said, no, I got a better way to do this, and showed him his way, and Morse adopted that person's code. That code was known as railroad code or American Morse code because it was confined, the United States is where it was developed, and the United States the only place that had it. And it was a little bit different from what we know as Morse code now. Most of the letters stayed the same, some of them were different. And they had a different way of spacing letters. Then when it moved to Europe, and the Europeans started using it, and when they laid the Atlantic cable during the 19th century, in the 1800s, they laid the cable across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States to Europe. What they came up with was what is called International Morse code, and everybody uses International Morse code now. It's simpler. It's much more consistent. You could transmit faster with American Morse code or railroad Morse code than you can with International Morse code, if given that you had equal capability in both systems. okay? But more people could learn international Morse code easier than they can learn railroad Morse code. So that's why it became standardized. So the Morse code we use in the telegraph system over there, that's in what's called international Morse code. So, did I answer your question? I forgot what your question was. I'll give you an answer. I want to make sure that I got the answer the right thing. I have a memory problem. You know. I can't remember what I did 2 minutes ago. I can remember what I did years ago, but not too. And you know, what do they tell you? Oh, that's normal for your age. Okay, other lesser positions became more common, so you started having, you know, dedicated ticket sellers. You started having assistants. So you'd have on a larger station, you would have an agent and an assistant agent, given that the agent was, you know, there was only one agent, not the person on duty. So they would have assistant agents. When you went to a city like Asheville or a bigger city like Charlotte, then they would have, you know, many, you know, multiple ticket sellers and you know, enough hours for all the agents, you know, that would come in and vacation time and thing, and as they started getting, you know, things like that. And then you had, you know, depot maintenance became, you know, a separate job. You would just hire somebody to do maintenance because, you know, sweep up and paint the place and put a garden up front. And they always had gardens and things in front of the original agents would plant gardens. In some cases, they lived at the station because, you know, they had to be there all the time anyway. And if you were single, it was free lodging. And so they would, you know, sleep in a back room. And remember, it was in town, you know, this is in the middle of town. So, you know, when you want to go get your meals at the you know, local cafe or whatever, you could do that. Or if you know, somebody's house, you know, that you knew, you know, sponge off them or whatever. So, you know, I'm sure the railroad agent found a deal, you know, that he would make a...
50 years later, it's Ingalls.
So his wife would be out on the farm and he'd be, you know, working at the station and until she found out. Okay, so at larger stations, the position of station agent became much more of a managerial job. They didn't sell tickets. Okay, now maybe if the got really busy, you know, a whole bunch of people wanted the ticket, they might help in. But it'd be more like what you see in the post office, where you don't normally see the postmaster on the bigger post office selling stamps and you know, taking packages. They were in the back, you know, with their paperwork, writing up reports about all the rest of the other people, you know, and figuring out how much they needed and ordering supplies and things like that. So, but that's what happened. And as they became managers, they were getting, you know, decent salaries now. The itinerary handling became a lot more complicated. The routes, you know, grew massively after the war. Okay, because now you all of a sudden had the Transcontinental Railroad, and you had trains all over the West now, going in all different places. And you had multiple Transcontinental Railroads after a while, in addition to far more railroads in the North and the South. And so when people wanted to go places, they could go almost any towns. And you had to figure out itineraries on all different places, and there would be multiple choices of routes. So you tried to route them as much as you could on your own railroad, but at some point, you know, if you were the Southern Railroad person and you had to route them to California, you know, to Pasadena, California or something, you know, you had to figure out which of the other railroads, because you actually sold the ticket to them for the whole route. And you all had to make the baggage arrangements for moving the baggage along the whole route. And so you had to figure out what's the best way. You know, they may be looking for the cheapest way. They may have been looking for the fastest way. They may have been looking for, you know, I want to take a sleeper. or I want to go first class, and some of the trains didn't have first class, some of them did, so you had to route them to what the trains. It's just like what the airlines, an airline agent has much more. Well, now it's all done with computers. And now you got to do it yourself. You got to go on the computer and come up with your own routing.
How did you keep the cars, not non-passenger cars, going where you wanted them to do?
You made up trying to think of the word.
Waybill.
Waybill, yeah. You made up a waybill that specified where, for every thing that was going. So if you came to me and said, I want to move my goods, I'd have to make up a waybill for that. If somebody came to me and said, I need 3 cars of stuff shipped in, you made up a waybill. But then what you had to do was you had to make up and that's the word I was trying to think of, where you would actually put the car number and what was in it and everything else. And that had to go with the train. Okay?
Did they go on the car
No,
itself?
no. It would be given to the conductor had that. Okay? Because the conductor ran the train. Okay, not the engineer. The engineer was just the driver. So, the conductor was a backseat driver, and the backseat driver decided everything. Okay, a engineer could not move a train without the permission of the conductor. Okay, and the conductor could not move the train without the permission of the dispatcher. And the dispatcher gave those permission with what they called, the clearance card pointed to the orders, the train orders, okay? There would be train orders. And the train order would either specify that this order belongs to for this one train, or all passenger trains it could be, or freight trains going over here, or this. Okay, so there would be all these train orders that said how fast you could go, and between here, where you have to stop, everything about it, where you have to drop off cars, etc. And there would be a clearance card that they would be given that had a list of numbers of those train orders that were given both to the engineer and the conductor. And they would have these in many cases, these they've got one of them here. They're these little,
Train order book.
the hoops, okay, that they were hold up to the engineer and give to the conductor that had the train orders, copy of the train order. The agent had to keep a copy of the train order, and there was another copy for the person at the other end. So there were copies of everybody. And initially they were written, and then they were done with the telegraph. They were also done with typewriters later on, and they would type up the train orders, and that would tell them where we were going, what cars were going where, and everything else about it. And it was the responsibility of the conductor to make sure that he dropped it off where he was supposed to and passed that information on, so that car went to maybe go to Chicago, but then it had to go to Moline, Illinois, would be routed to Moline and put on the train, attach your train going to Moline. Okay, so those were all passed on. Oh yes, it was very complicated, still complicated. It's all done by computers now, but it's still very complicated. And that's why a lot of times now the big railroads are giving up these, short lines to a short line company because they just want to run the main routes. And then when they get to Asheville, they drop it off and they tell Blue Ridge Southern Railroad, bring it down to Hendersonville or bring it over to Andrews, and Blue Ridge Southern owns the tracks or leases the tracks that take it out to Andrews or down to Hendersonville. And same thing with going back. Blue Ridge brings it up and then drops it off and gives it to Norfolk Southern. Okay, and they also had to handle mail that fully went to railroads. And then they would put on the railroad cars on the trains with postal officers, and those post office people would do all the sorting of the mail, and they would actually drop it off at each station and pick up the mail. So there was an automated arm that reached out that grabbed the mail that was on the thing, and they took the bill of mail that they had for that station, and they threw it
The
out.
person in the mail car on the train, was he an employee?
He was a postal employee,
Postal employee.
yes, and they were all armed. They had to be armed, because they carried bullion, gold bullion, and they transferred a lot of money. But they always were armed. And they had to be ready to fight. So it wasn't like they show in the movies where they pulled if these guys started jumping aboard the train, they pulled out their guns and started shooting. So they had to handle a lot more mail, because now all of a sudden there were a lot more people in a lot more places, and mail suddenly grew quite big. And this continued all the way up until, I think it was, I don't remember when they stopped putting mail on trains, and they went to, and nothing was driven, it was all put on airplanes in the 60s, I think.
Middle 70s.
What's that?
Middle 70s.
Middle 70s, okay. Yeah. He remembers, I don't remember. I knew all that, but I don't remember. It's interesting to see what a mail car looks like. You go down to the Southeastern RR Museum in Atlanta, you can actually walk through their mail car and see it, and you have all these, the bags and where the guys were sitting, and they would just sit there and sort mail. Okay, in summary, the position of the railroad agent moved from varying, so they did different things depending upon the size of the station and what the railroad wanted at that particular time, and as the railroad changed hands, the rules might change. It became far more standardized and refined. So as railroad started saying, hey, wait, Union Pacific is doing better than our railroad, let's adopt Union Pacific's way, it's much easier. They would then make that to be their standard. And so eventually the railroads pretty much standardized on everything, on the type of tickets and everything. And it's an interesting story about tickets, by the way. In 1900, the railroads estimated that 50% of all tickets being used were counterfeit. Can you imagine if the airlines, that half their tickets were counterfeit? Okay, because their tickets were just, pieces of paper that somebody had written something on. And there was no evidence that it was real. I mean, anybody could get some of that blank stock and right there, John Smith and going from New York City to Washington, D.C. in a sleeper, and get on the train. And so they came out with Union Pacific, I think, came out with the came up with, I think it was Southern Pacific, I think. They came up with the, what they call the Lomax ticket, because the guy that was head of passenger service was named Lomax. And it required that it was punched out, and there was a stamp on the front and the signature. And within 20 years, it had to be replaced because that was being counterfeited. So they came out with a new one that had 5 signatures. You had to go in at the railroad depot. You had to walk in there. You had to sign the agent that sold you the ticket, signed that you had signed. You would sign there your name. The railroad agent would put his signature on there, verifying that you had signed it in front of him. Okay. The conductor had to sign it, that you showed it to that thing, and then if you got to another station, there were, other people had to sign it, and you had to sign it again when you got on board the train. So there actually were 5 signature blocks and 3 stamps. Okay, so they had to be stamped by different people. So these things looked like they were, plus of course being punched out. So now of course Amtrak uses QR codes and you could put them on your smartphone, or you could print them out on your computer, your ticket, or you could have them issue a paper ticket, a cardboard ticket. But that's going away. So, but that's the kind of changes that have come through in terms of the effort that it started taking, starting in the 19th century, to try to standardize things. Because if you were bought a ticket from Southern Railroad here, and you were going to, a place that Southern didn't travel, it's the next railroad had to believe that you came off the Southern train and that your ticket was a valid Southern ticket, okay? And, if they weren't familiar with it, it was like the old days, with the driver's license. You went to another state, all the police officers had no idea what in Alabama, they had no idea what the Michigan driver's license looked like until they had enough experience with it. Okay? So you almost showed up with almost anything, and that was a driver's license. Didn't have your picture on it or anything. Just had, your name and you had a license. I remember New York, the licenses it would be easy to fake. So, it wouldn't fake anybody in New York, but it would in any other state, Well, not New Jersey probably wouldn't fake. They'd probably shoot you and bury you. He'd give you concrete shoes. But if you went down to, Mississippi, they probably wouldn't recognize that. So, anyway, okay, so work depots, minimal agents, railroads adopted common practices for interlining so they could transfer easier between the railroads. Flatboard depots and stations. The depots eventually became either cookie cutter or architectural. This would be a cookie cutter station. This station design would be duplicated in dozens of cities, so that they didn't have to redesign everything. The architectural ones would be ones typically in bigger cities, and they typically were beautiful, and Atlanta had a beautiful station. Most of the big cities had these beautiful, custom designed stations. You go to Grand Central Terminal in New York, it's absolutely fabulous looking. And the original Penn Station was beautiful. And Chicago Union Station,
And the soon-to-reopen one in Detroit.
yeah, the soon-to-be reopened one in Detroit. And also the one if you go up to Bristol, Virginia, it's absolutely beautiful station there. I've seen that one from the outside. But most of them became cookie cutter, but they were standard size stations. There was a station that was this size, and there would be a station that would be the size of Hendersonville, which was bigger, and there would be a station the size, and then they would extend them as necessary. And add on to the size of the stations if they grew big enough. And war handling became better defined. So, after, between the Civil War and in 1900, you had the war against Spain in 1898, okay? By that time, they were very, very adept at moving military equipment and things because of that. And of course, into the 20th century, with the war against Mexico and the war, World War I and World War II and the Korean War and Vietnam and all these other wars, they became very good at moving military equipment. Okay, and that, again, with the agents that had to be heavily involved in that. Okay, any other questions?
Charging batteries for the telegraph, how did that work out?
I'm sorry?
How did they charge the batteries for the telegraph?
I don't really know. I think they brought in, they had some way, they did have, I think, a hand charging or something, or they,
And that,
the steam-driven motors or whatever. But remember, it was before the 20th century when electricity came out.
Yeah.
They would have,
Did they use like lead acid batteries?
what's that?
Lead acid batteries?
Yeah,
Okay, so you just dump more acid in them,
yeah, probably,
and that essentially charges them.
yeah. That's right, you could do that. But they were liquid type of lead acid batteries. I mean, they weren't like the modern lead acid batteries. We actually can put acid in them, but, you don't do that regularly.
Well,
Okay.
y'all, thank you so much, John. We appreciate that. It was wonderful.
Probably just the water.